This is a special podcast series called How to Run Trophy Gold. My name is Jason Cordova. I'm the publisher of the Trophy RPG, as well as the author of the Incursion Hester's Mill and the Hearthfire Rules module for Trophy Gold. Trophy Gold is not a difficult game to run, but it does have some unique and unusual mechanics and procedures. The purpose of this series is to explain the rules in a way that helps you better understand how to be a GM in Trophy Gold, as well as highlighting some of the design theory and play philosophies that help explain why the game is the way it is. This series assumes you have read the rules for Trophy Gold. You can get a quick start copy of those rules by going to our Kickstarter campaign page for the Trophy RPG, which is linked in the show notes. The show notes will also contain a link to a Gauntlet forums post associated with this episode. If, after listening to this, you still have some questions, you can ask me on that forums post. This series is a production of The Gauntlet. You can follow The Gauntlet on Twitter at GauntletRPG, or learn more about us on our website, gauntlet-rpg.com. If you appreciate this show and want to support it financially, you can do so by making a pledge on the Gauntlet Patreon, patreon.com/gauntlet. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the anatomy of a Trophy Gold incursion. And before we start to get into those details, I want you to keep two big ideas in mind. The first is that sometimes you have to improvise when running Trophy Gold. The second is that Trophy Gold is a game about collaborative storytelling, okay? In many ways, the incursion is just the skeleton of an adventure. The meat, the blood, the sinew of your story, that's on you and the group to do, right? So just keep those two ideas in mind as we go through this. Now, the first part of the incursion is the introduction. The introduction can take many forms. It can be a bit of prose that details the backstory or the history of the adventure. It can be a poem there to establish some kind of mood. The important thing to keep in mind when you are presenting the introduction to the players is first understand the goal of the introduction. So if the goal of the introduction is clearly to establish a mood, then you should, read it or present it in a moody way, right? If it's a poem, read it with a little bit of flair, right? If the goal of the introduction is to establish some basics of the setting or to impart some basic information, make sure that all the details of that information are clear to the players. Make sure they understand it. Another thing to keep in mind is be careful not to reveal information that the players should not yet know. It's very possible that in order to make everything seem a little more logical for the GM, that the author of the incursion included information within the introduction that the players should not yet know. Just be aware of that. So if we look at Hester's Mill, that incursion, the introduction is divided into two parts, the known history and the secret history. The known history, you can just read that to the players, just word for word. But the secret history, you don't say anything about that until later on. There's a point in the incursion where they can unlock the secret history, at which point you can kind of go through that stuff with them. The next part of the incursion is the theme. This section usually includes the theme word plus a paragraph describing some of the ways that the theme is used in the incursion, and possibly will include some tips for how to use the theme word in your own improvisations, right? Going back to this idea of sometimes you have to improvise. Theme is really important in Trophy generally. The way the incursions work for Dark and Gold is that the moments, the conditions, the details, the treasures, the monsters, they usually have some kind of connection to the theme word. And we do this because we want the story to have a coherent feel, and theme is one of the ways you accomplish that. Now, theme can be a very powerful tool for you as a GM because sometimes you do have to improvise a little bit on the fly. Or maybe you like to just do a little bit of extra prep, like maybe you like to prepare a few encounters ahead of time just in case, the players zig when you thought they would zag, right? Theme is how you can make sure that those creations or improvisations can be very consistent with the incursion, right? So long as you're touching some of those thematic notes, some of those visual motifs, you're in good shape. And one other thing I'll point out about theme before we leave is that theme operates almost on a subconscious or unconscious level. This is something that the author of Trophy, Jesse Ross, and I have discussed at length in the past, which is when we're playing Trophy Dark or Trophy Gold, the theme tends to worm its way into everyone's head, and it kind of comes out in the collaborative storytelling, right? So theme, again, helps create that space for really good, rich, collaborative storytelling, on-the-fly storytelling that still feels very coherent with what came before. The next part of the incursion is the flowchart, or a diagram, or possibly a map. This diagram or map is there to show how the sets flow into one another. Now, a set is what Trophy Gold incursions, it's the subdivision of a Trophy Gold incursion, right? It's divided up into sets. The diagram or the map just shows how they flow to one another and their relative positions to one another. Now, this is not a detailed thing like you might find in a traditional adventure. It's not a dungeon map, okay? It's a more abstract presentation of what the adventure space looks like, right? And here I want to talk a little bit about the concept of sort of spatial abstraction in Trophy Gold, because it's really important to understand for the gameplay. So in a traditional dungeon crawl, say for D&D or something similar, you're going to have a lot of detail on the map, right? You're going to know that, okay, this corridor is 10 feet wide and has ceilings that are, 10 feet high. It goes down approximately 50 feet. It turns left into a chamber that's a 20 feet square. There's a door on the opposite side of that chamber. It's locked, and so forth, right? Lots of granular detail. And that is perfectly fine. It's a different style of gameplay than Trophy Gold. In Trophy Gold, we don't concern ourselves with those granular details because we want to have space to do improvisations, to do collaborative storytelling, right? And here's what I mean. So recently I ran a game of Trophy Gold, and as part of a devil's bargain, someone suggested, okay, if you accept this devil's bargain, there will be some kind of creature clinging to the ceiling in the darkness, watching everything we do. Now, if we had said going into that space that the ceiling was only 10 feet high, then we would not really have had the room to do a devil's bargain like that, right? But once the devil's bargain was made, suddenly we all have the idea that, oh, the ceiling probably is high enough for a creature to be up there, right? It's not something we considered when the characters walked into the space, but now that it's been offered as part of a devil's bargain, now it's part of our shared fiction, right? This is the power of this kind of abstraction, right? We don't care about all the different turns in a dungeon. Like, we don't care if it turns left here, turns right there, goes north here, goes south there. We just care that it's a twisty passage. That's it, right? We just care if a space is small or large. We don't really get into the details. And by not getting into those details, we're able to fill in fun things at the table that maybe no one anticipated. Certainly the author of the Incursion didn't anticipate. Now we're going to talk about sets, and sets are the bulk of the Incursion in Trophy Gold. They are the subdivision, and they represent lots of different types of spaces. So a set can be a single room. A set can be a whole level of a dungeon. A set can be a single object if it's a particularly complicated object with lots of stuff to interact with. The key thing is that everything in the set is unified by an idea, right? So for example, if the set is an entire level of dungeon, the thing that unifies it might be that that level of the dungeon is haunted by a ghost. And so that's the set, this ghost-haunted level of dungeon. If the set is a throne room, the thing that unifies it are all the details related to it being a throne room, right? A throne, maybe rich tapestries, maybe there are, courtiers or something. Maybe there's something going on that makes it a throne room, right? The key is the set, everything in the set is unified by an idea, right? And frequently this idea goes back into the theme as well. So let's talk about the different components of a set. First, we have set name and set goal. I'm going to take those together. So the set name is just a way of understanding what the set is. A set goal is a goal that either the player characters are trying to accomplish, or it's a goal that we would like to see happen, like a story goal that we're interested in at the table, okay? Now, for the set name and the set goal, it's very important that you tell the players what those things are. You read them to the players, even if doing so would reveal information their characters would not know. Now, in a future episode of this series called Set Goals and Hunt Rolls, I'm going to talk about why this is okay and indeed desirable. But for now, just know you should read the set name and the set goal to the players. The next part of the set is the overview. This is a short description of what the set is about. Normally, it points out some props that are coming up, and just gives you a basic idea of what the set is. Usually you can read this information to the players, but just be mindful. If there's something that's obviously secret information, don't read that. The next part of the set is a list of moments. Moments are little descriptive details that help bring the scene, the set, the whole incursion to life. They have a vividness to them. Now, what I love about moments is, okay, so when we think about who is the classically, who's the rock star GM? Who's the GM who we all just, we love, like, we're in their game, we're like, oh man, he was so awesome, she was so awesome. Normally, one of the things we say about that GM is that they were very, very good with their descriptive details, right? They brought the scene to life by describing things. These moments help you do that in Trophy Gold. They are little things that you can pepper in just to make everything seem a little bit more alive, a little bit more vivid, and again, to reinforce the theme. You can use moments in pretty much anywhere. I mean, they are tied to a particular set normally, but they don't have to be. I mean, if you just are kind of looking for something at a moment, you can grab any of them, right? And put them wherever. I like to use them in transitions. So if the player characters are moving from one place to another, particularly from one set to another, but even within the set, I like to use the moments as a way of kind of memorializing that transition, just to make it a little, make it a little interesting, a little colorful. The next thing are props. Now, props are objects or locations within the set that players can interact with, okay? Normally, when the characters enter the set, you point out a prop or two that they can interact with. Sometimes if they can see them all, you point them all out. But in any case, you have to give them something, or otherwise they won't know what to do when they enter the set, right? A prop is a prompt to go interact with things, right? Sometimes the props include specific notes for the GM. So for example, if we look at Hester's Mill, one of the sets is the village of Hester's Mill, and one of the props is the cottages. And within that description of that prop, it says, a question to pose to the players: in what ways have St. Hester's symbols been altered to make them profane? So here we see in the prop, the GM is given a little bit of help for how to make this scene more textured and interesting, right? So props frequently include information like that, but not always. Props can also include notes for special ways players can interact with them. So for example, if there's a special type of role or a special rule of some sort, the prop will sometimes include a note about that. Next, we have traps. Traps are literal traps or monsters that are almost certainly in the set. I'd say definitely in the set, but that's not always the case depending on how the roleplay goes. But very, very likely these traps and monsters are in the set and are going to be a problem, especially if the character or if the players roll poorly on a hunt roll, right? Now, note that monsters are usually noted in this section of the incursion, but their stats are not actually broken down there. You go a little further down in the set to see what their stats are. And here again, just like props, this can include notes for special ways that players can interact with the traps or ways in which the traps or monsters can affect them, right? So if we look at the farmhouse set in Hester's Mill, one of the traps is about this scarecrow that can inflict terrible dreams on people who sleep in the farmhouse, right? That's an example of some direction that the GM is given for how this trap sort of interacts with the players, right? How the players interact with it. Next, we have treasures, and like the traps, these are treasures that are definitely in the set, right? Meaning they can be found in specific places or in specific ways. A great example is in Hester's Mill, in the very first set, the Torrens Bend set, we have a treasure that is hidden inside the hollow portion of the base of a statue, right? There's a hollowed out base that this statue is standing on, and a secret panel opens up and you can get the treasure inside, right? And here I want to point out an example. So in the Torrens Bend set of Hester's Mill, there is a treasure that reads the following. The plinth Lord Galdrin's statue stands on is hollow. A secret panel on the back of it gives access to the hollow space, inside of which is a sack of coins, likely put there by someone needing to make a quick escape. The sack's contents are worth 2 gold. Now, I want to point something out about how Trophy Gold plays here. This is an important gameplay note, which is this. The only way the player characters can find that sack of coin is if they investigate around the base of the statue, okay? It's not enough for them to say, oh, I'm just looking generally in the area, right? They actually have to indicate that they're doing something specific that would allow them to find the stuff in that base of that statue. So maybe they say, my character takes his sword and begins tapping around the statue, or my character is closely examining how the statue is put together to see if there's anything unusual, right? They have to say something like that or they cannot find this treasure. And the way it would work is they do a hunt roll, and if the hunt roll is successful, even if it's not successful, honestly, they do the hunt roll, and then you have the discretion as a GM to decide whether they find that treasure inside the statue or not. Because bear in mind, On a hunt roll, the only thing that players are entitled to is a token. That's it. It's up to you as the GM to decide whether they've done enough to actually find something specific, right? We're going to talk about this idea more in that episode called Set Goals and Hunt Rolls, but for now, just bear in mind that in order to find these treasures, the players must do things that would conceivably, plausibly cause them to find it, right? Next, we have additional traps and additional treasures. These are traps and treasures that might be in the set. So in the game, whenever players collect hunt roll tokens, they can spend a hunt roll token to get a treasure, right? These additional treasures are one of the ways that you can kind of satisfy that, right? You can just grab a treasure from there and say they find that. Same thing on the hunt roll, they sometimes encounter something terrible. Well, the additional traps are things that you can use for that. Not always, it's not an exhaustive list by any means. Sometimes you have to just make something up, but these are there just as a thing to kind of ping and say, okay, well, maybe it's one of these things, right? Importantly, these lists are meant to inspire your improvising, right? We talked about how you have to improvise sometimes. And so these lists are really more inspiration, I think, than being an exhaustive list of the things that might be in the set. So for example, if we look in Hester's Mill and the Torrens Bend, the additional treasures are documents and ledgers. That's one of them. Well, documents and ledgers can be a lot of different things, right? Maybe it's a banknote. Maybe it's a family tree. Maybe it's some kind of, maybe it's a legit ledger that like describes, various like grain shipments or whatever, right? You can kind of go a little deeper and expand that out as needed, right? Another example, in the Road to Hester's Mill set, the additional traps say a bear trap lying in wait. Okay, so a bear trap, that's a great thing to spring on the player characters if they are doing a hunt roll and they're not watching where they're walking, right? But a bear trap lying in wait implies lots of other things, right? It implies other types of traps that might be lying in wait, like a snare trap or a spike pit trap, right? It implies that there might be a bear. So if you need for the characters to encounter something terrible, maybe the bear is there, right? Maybe there's a bear and, you have to come up with, some quick stats for the bear if they're going to fight it, but, or maybe they do a risk roll to escape it or whatever. But the point is, a bear trap lying in wait is not the totality of the possible additional traps in the set, right? It is just inspiration for what might kind of be in the area. The next part of the set are the monster stat blocks. So the monsters are mentioned in the trap section, but they're detailed in their stat block. Now, importantly, and this is very, very, very important, you do not say the name of the monster, okay? So the very first monster in Hester's Mill is a ghoul, right? But you don't call it a ghoul to the players, right? In Trophy Gold, the players hold the privilege of naming monsters, not you. So do not ever say, oh, it's a ghoul, right? We list it as a ghoul so that just organizationally, as the GM, you can kind of find it easily and kind of mentally know what you're looking for. But the true name is left to the players. So you instead use a description, right, when you present the monster. And in the case of the ghoul, you would say, an emaciated humanoid with razor-sharp teeth, yellow feral eyes that stinks like the grave, that sort of thing, right? There's a description there to use. Now, there's one caveat to this never speak the monster's name rule, and that is the case in which the monster is somewhat unique and has like a personal name. So in Hester's Mill, the sort of big bad of the whole incursion is a greater demon called Malfast. Well, that creature's name is Malfast. The players don't get to rename Malfast. It is Malfast. Now they may not know the name, in which case, you can just refer to it, by its description, but in fact, it is called Malfast. So looking at the rest of the monster stat block, we have the endurance number. That is the number that in a combat roll, the players need to roll on 2 dice in order to defeat it. We have D6 behaviors. These are things that the monster might be doing when encountered. And going back to kind of what I said about the moments, this is another way in which the incursion helps you as the GM be a rockstar GM, right? Because it gives you some nice descriptive things that you can kind of that you can kind of speak to the table in order to make the monster come alive, right? We have defenses. Now, defenses are special abilities and powers that the monster might have in order to defend itself or even, to attack with, right? In any case, there's special abilities, special powers. We're going to discuss defenses in a lot more detail in an episode of this series called Combat and Risk, but for now, just know basically what they are. And then we have the weaknesses. Now, I want to point out here that Players will often want to discover the weakness of monsters. And the reason why this is because they know, mechanically, if they know the monster's weakness, then they get an advantage in fighting the monster, right? And you have to be a little careful in how you reveal the weakness of the monster. So the automatic, easy way of the players learning the monster's weakness is to do so when they go back to town, right? When the characters go back to town, they can spend a gold to discover knowledge about a named monster, and learning the weakness is one of those pieces of information they can get. So that's the easy way. But players will often want to figure out what the weakness is in the middle of the incursion, and you can do that. I say let them do that. And it kind of goes back to what I said earlier about when I was talking about the example of searching the statue. The players have to do something in the fiction that would logically lead to them discovering the weakness, right? I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about here. So in a game I recently ran, it was in the Incursion was Hester's Mill, in fact, they had captured the ghoul, which they didn't call ghouls, by the way. They named them the Ravenous Creepers. But they had a Ravenous Creeper captured, and the weakness of it is holy symbols. And the player wanted to know more about them, and so his character started to use various techniques to try to discover what the weakness was. Grabbed a torch and waved fire at it to see if it was particularly frightened of fire, interacted with it in different ways. The one thing the player did not do is talk about holy symbols or holy water or anything like that. And so he didn't learn the weakness. It was as simple as that, right? I think in another game like, say, Dungeon World, where you could roll discern realities or spout lore and just automatically get the answer, this is not like that, right? Again, the players have to work for it a little bit. They have to show some ingenuity in how they discover these things. So if they do something that is particularly clever or that really, really hones in on, or I should say, is logically connected to the weakness, then give it to them. But otherwise, don't. The final part of the set are special rules. And not every set will have this, but some sets do. For example, in Hester's Mill, the farmhouse set has a special rule for the nightmare roll. And I'm not going to read that off, but just know that that's a good example of one. And one thing I'll point out here as the GM that you need to kind of understand is whenever there's a special rule or special roll or something like that in a set, it means that the author of the incursion intends for this to be a particularly dramatic or important moment in the story. And so you should try to set it up to where the players interact with that in some way. And now the final part of the overall incursion is the conclusion. Much like the introduction, the conclusion can take many forms. So just be sure to read it and understand generally what the conclusion is trying to accomplish. There are lots of different things that the conclusions typically try to accomplish, such as ways to continue the adventure, ideas for what should happen in the story if certain story threads didn't get unraveled, that kind of thing. There's no real right or wrong way of handling the conclusion, but just, read it, be aware of it, because ideally it leads to some kind of epilogue or some kind of clue about where the story should go. And so that's the anatomy of a Trophy Gold incursion. I hope you found that helpful. If you have any further questions, please find the forums post for this episode, which is linked in the show notes.